Of every genre, horror has probably evolved the most. The first horror film is almost impossible to define, but many people argue it is 1896's The House of the Devil. House of the Devil takes place in an abandoned castle, where the audience watches as the devil interacts with various spooky creatures. While many agree this is a horror film in themes, its intended purpose was to amaze and entertain audiences, not to scare them. And while we would see horror tropes and characters in the following 3 decades, the term horror wasn't used to describe these films. Rather, they were folktales or book adaptations. In fact, it wasn't until 1931's Dracula that we really saw horror used as a term to describe pictures meant to scare their audience. Upon Dracula's release, its reviews called it everything from the best of the many mystery films to an exciting melodrama. The horror label would be placed upon these films soon enough, though. 1931's Dracula was a turning point, to say the least. This was the first sound adaptation of the novel and stage play, and while it is hardly scary by today's standards a century later, it was terrifying to American audiences at the time. Universal Pictures produced Dracula, and they struck gold with the film, which critically and commercially soared. Bela Lugosi's portrayal of the Count proved to be iconic, and his mannerisms and wardrobe are likely still what you think of first when you think of the character today. And while Universal had made the film with the original guise of adapting a successful play, they soon saw that there was much greater potential with the Dracula character. Forget sequels. Universal soon saw the potential of the first cinematic universe, the Universal monster movies. The Birth. When Dracula was first released, it was actually deemed too scary. In the original ending, where Universal stalwart Edward Van Sloan wished the audience good night and told them that the characters they just saw were real and vampires did exist, was cut from future reissues of the film. So, Universal had a tall order for their follow-up to Dracula. It couldn't be too scary. It had to be an already established story, and it needed to be made fast. The studio turned to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, one of the most iconic books of the 19th century, and put pedal to the metal when it came to producing the film. In fact, if you had to guess which year Frankenstein came out, would you guess 1933? 1932? Nope. Frankenstein ended up releasing in 1931, the same year that Dracula came out. Talk about a fast turnaround. Frankenstein was huge, too, and it was a career-making performance for Boris Karloff as Frankenstein's monster. Famously, Bela Lugosi of Dracula fame was supposed to play the monster, but he turned down the role as he found it to be beneath him. He would go on to regret this for the rest of his life. Frankenstein, like Dracula, introduced iconic horror imagery that we still see today, like a hunchback sidekick to Dr. Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster having bolts sticking out of his head. And while my own opinion has no bearing on the history of the Universal monsters, I have to mention that I find Frankenstein to be undoubtedly the better film. I mentioned that Dracula was seen as too scary, but one enormously controversial scene in Frankenstein, where the monster accidentally drowns a little girl offering him a flower, is still shocking by even today's standards. And that's saying something. 3 more iconic Universal monster movies would soon follow. The Mummy in 1932, The Invisible Man in 1933, and The Bride of Frankenstein in 1935, a direct sequel to the 1931 film and what many consider to be the strongest of all of Universal's monster movies. But in the complex history of film, movie quality has always been second to profit, and Universal began to see the immense profit that these early horror films could offer. 1940 saw the release of 3 Universal monster movies: The Invisible Man Returns, The Mummy's Hand, and The Invisible Woman, which is actually more of a comedy than it is a monster movie. The 1940s became the golden decade for Universal's monsters, with 22 monster movies released in the decade, an average of over 2 every year. Some of the best include 1942's The Invisible Agent, which is a World War II spy thriller involving the Invisible Man becoming an agent to spy on the Nazis. The Wolfman from 1941, which introduced a new Universal monster based on the werewolf. Frankenstein meets the Wolfman from 1943, which was the first monster movie to combine iconic characters across different franchises. And 1948's Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which combined not only all of the iconic Universal monsters, but also added comedic duo Abbott and Costello into the mix. While these 22 movies can be rather hit or miss, Universal perfected the monster movie formula. And it was looking like this birth may be on golden pastures. Would the Universal monster movie ever die? The death. If you want to see the history of our world over the last 100 years, look no further than the horror movies that define each generation. Film scholar Robin Wood considers the horror genre to be the collective nightmares of a culture. In the 1970s, with the Vietnam War and the idea of brutality within all of us, horror movies showed masked killers with everyday weapons like knives or chainsaws. They could be your neighbor. In our modern day, horror focuses on everything from social justice issues to the threats of global diseases. And in the 1950s, on the heels of the Cold War and Oppenheimer's atomic bomb, the world was no longer interested in vampires and mummies. The real threat was radiation. Godzilla was born out of the atomic bomb, as were the giant mutant ants in them. And while we were busy fearing foreign invasions, there was no foreign invasion scarier than the threat of aliens, as seen in Invasion of the Body Snatchers or The Thing from Another Planet. We were also beginning to see space exploration as a real possibility, and who knew what could be discovered just beyond the stars. It should come as no surprise then that the Universal monsters began to make less and less money as the 40s gave way to the 50s. In the 1950s, a mere 5 monster movies were made by Universal, a far cry from the 22 of the decade prior. And the 1950s would be the final decade of the monster's original run, with 1956's The Creature Walks Among Us being their last showing, pandering to a new generation.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
When the teenagers of the 1950s wanted nothing to do with the Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff films their parents had grown up on. But as the film has been reevaluated and reevaluated, it is now seen as one of the strongest horror films of the 1950s, and an undeniable influence on the likes of Guillermo del Toro. The underwater cinematography is incredible, and the film's message of leaving jungle secrets untouched is an overused theme, but one that is as well done here as the likes of King Kong or Jurassic Park. Still, in the history of Universal's monster movies, the birth of the creature signaled the death of the monsters. And 1956's final Creature from the Black Lagoon film saw the franchise end with a whimper. The death of the Universal monsters is a long one. As mentioned earlier, each generation of moviegoers connect with a different kind of horror. And the interesting thing is, the Universal monsters have tried to adapt to every single generation. Whether it be Francis Ford Coppola's gothic reimagining of Dracula starring Winona Ryder and Keanu Reeves, or Brendan Fraser's adventure comedy Mummy franchise, or even the Best Picture winning The Shape of Water, which is Del Toro's take on the creature. The monsters continue to reinvent themselves, often to disastrous results.
Universal announced yesterday that their shared universe of monster movies will officially go under the new heading Dark Universe.
One famous disaster of the last decade was Universal's planned Dark Universe, which would see the monsters in a new cinematic universe for the first time since the original films of the 40s. The announcement was a publicity stunt in itself, when Russell Crowe, Tom Cruise, Johnny Depp, Javier Bardem, and Sofia Boutella all got together to announce the upcoming Dark Universe, which would begin with Tom Cruise's 2017 film The Mummy and would follow with the 2019 Bride of Frankenstein. Directors were announced, A-listers were cast, and the entire franchise was shelved before The Mummy finished its historically bad box office run. Every once in a while, we get a great monster film, like 2020's The Invisible Man, or 2023's Renfield. Just kidding on that last one.
Thank you. You saved my life. Did I watch you cut a guy with a decorative serving platter? did in the rest.
But it's pretty safe to say that the monster films pale in comparison to the horror that audiences are currently clamoring for. But this video covers the birth, death, and rebirth of the Universal monsters. So, where is the rebirth? The rebirth. It's very difficult to cleanly delegate the monster's history to distinct years, but there is an argument to be made that we are currently entering the rebirth of the monsters, even as films suffer under bad creative direction. Universal's Dark Universe was certainly a failure, but no more so than the failure of with 2 in 2023 alone, with Renfield and The Last Voyage of the Demeter. The future looks bright, too, with The Invisible Man's success promising a future Wolfman movie starring Ryan Gosling in the titular role. And as we are currently in a time period where there is much more than movies in the entertainment sphere, we should look at the monsters on the whole. Universal currently has an annual haunted house at their theme parks every year, with their horror nights being home to a variety of mazes featuring iconic villains, including one for the Universal monsters. Although remakes can come and go without much fanfare, several remakes and sequels for Universal monster movies are in the works, such as continuations of Brendan Fraser's Mummy films, a sequel to 2020's Invisible Man, and many fresh takes on familiar stories. If I had to give one reason we're looking at a rebirth of the monster movies, it's because we are currently in an explosion of content, with thousands of movies released in a single year, alongside thousands of TV shows, video games, podcasts, novels, comics, and more. Turning these monster movies into a universe is undoubtedly a bad, terrible idea, and if Universal is adamant that Renfield needs to be connected to the Invisible Man, then we are almost certainly still in the death phase of the monsters, and no rebirth is in sight. But if we're looking at a potential rebirth, it's because these films can be shaped and twisted tonally to fit unique audiences. I haven't seen Renfield, mostly because I'm not a huge Nicolas Cage fan, but from what I've heard, Cage's version of Dracula is perhaps the only reason that movie is worth seeing. And Cage's Dracula can pull in audiences, but if Universal goes ahead with a darker version of Dracula, they should not hesitate to cast someone else. The main reason these characters have lasted as long as they have is because they are so incredibly malleable. They can show up in cartoons, video games, cereal boxes, and everyone knows who they are because their look is burned into our collective consciousness. I think the death and the rebirth of the monsters are constantly fluctuating, but I don't hesitate to say that we're in a rebirth because I struggle to see a world where these characters ever die. Everyone knows Frankenstein's monster, even if they mistakenly call him Frankenstein. And as long as that is the case, these characters are no more dead than Count Dracula himself. It's almost Halloween, and we've got more spooky videos coming up soon. Stay tuned, and remember, vampires are real.
No, this is no dream. This is Dracula.